So, welcome to Friday Frontliners. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to be here with Margot Livesey and Chris Castellani. My name is Margaret Pinard. I'm from A Mighty Blaze, and I'm going to give you a little information on our lovely guests today before they're going to take it away with the conversation. Margot Livesey grew up in a boys' private school in the Scottish Highlands where her father taught and her mother, Eva, was the school nurse. After taking a BA in English and philosophy at the University of York in England, she spent most of her 20s working in shops and restaurants and learning to write. Her first book, a collection of stories called Learning by Heart, was published in 1986. Since then, Margot has published 8 novels. I'll leave all the titles to be explored by you guys. Her 9th novel, The Boy in the Field, is what we are here today to celebrate. Woohoo! Margot's taught at many universities, workshops, prestigious organizations. She's been the recipient of numerous fellowships, including the Guggenheim Foundation, the NEA. She's currently teaching at the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, and she lives with her husband, a painter, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but goes back to London and Scotland whenever she can. And we're all jealous because none of us can do that now, right? And to interview her today, we have Chris Castellani, his most recent novel, Leading Men, for which he received fellowships from the Guggenheim as well, and the Massachusetts Cultural Council and MacDowell. It's just been published in paperback. He's also the author of 3 other novels and The Art of Perspective, Who Tells the Story? Sounds like a Hamilton line. A collection of essays on point of view in fiction. Castellani is on the faculty of the Warren Wilson MFA program and the Breadloaf Writers Conference. He lives in Boston, where he's the artistic director of Grub Street. So take it away, and I will fade into the furniture.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those wonderful introductions. And hello, my dear Margot. I am so happy to have you all to myself for this time, and so that I have the opportunity to speak with you about this little miracle of a book. As I've already told you, I loved this book so much, and I read it. I've been reading it, a little at a time, slowly over the course of the past month or so, and I partly because, as you do with all of your books, every sentence, every syllable, every chapter, every movement of the book is so intentional and so important that you want to sit with it, and I just loved getting to know these characters so much, and I loved the mystery at the heart of it, which I will not spoil in this conversation. We'll talk about mystery, but I won't reveal any secrets, I hope. So I just wanted to start by just thanking you for writing such a wonderful book that has been such great company during this summer. And it's a book that feels like a bit of a what's the word? Not a retreat, but a going into a time. This is set in the late 90s. A time that is not now is basically what I'm trying to say. A book that transports us to a different time that was not necessarily less complicated, but does feel a little bit less complicated in hindsight. And yet, what's in the relationships between the characters and in the mystery, of course, isn't uncomplicated at all, and that's part of the joy. But before, I don't want to ramble on anymore. So just for the benefit of our listeners and watchers who haven't had the chance to read the book yet, can you just tell me, how did you get the idea for the book? Sort of standard intro question. How did you get the idea for the book? Where did it come from, and how did it develop?
Chris, I can't have anyone I'd rather talk to than you. The only downside to this conversation is that I'm just longing to get to the next ferry to join you.
Yes, well, yeah, please come to Provincetown. Yes, please.
After I published a novel called The Flight of Gemma Hardy, someone I had been at school with in Scotland contacted me. I hadn't seen him in nearly 40 years, and he was in the boys' school, so I barely knew him, but we had lunch in New York, and he described how one day he had come home from school on a summer afternoon, and at the bottom of the garden in his tiny, tiny village, a place where no one ever locked their doors, he found the body of a woman who'd been murdered.
Oh, wow.
And her legs were covered in blood, and his first thought was that she was somehow wearing the uniform of the local schoolboys who wore bright red knee socks.
Oh, wow.
And he was only in her presence for maybe less than 10 seconds, perhaps, before he fled to get help. But those 10 seconds changed his life.
Oh, wow.
He had been heading to study medicine, and he went in a completely different direction. And the story made a profound impression on me, both because of the bucolic setting and the shock of it, and that sense of someone's life jumping the tracks because of something almost random,
right,
completely unexpected.
Wow.
And that stayed with me almost like a picture over the years when I was working on another novel, Mercury. And that story gradually converged with another story in my own life, which is that after my mother died when I was 2.5, my mother Eva died, and then my father died when I was 22. And at that point, I believed myself to have no living relatives. My parents were both only children of only children. And so I thought there's no one I share DNA with. And then a former student was doing research on Ancestry.com into my family, and someone contacted her and said, do you know if Eva McEwen had a daughter?
Wow.
And I discovered that contrary to what I'd believed for, nearly 40 years at this point, I had all these relatives. They just happened to be in Australia. And eventually I went to meet them. And I hadn't been with anyone to whom I was related in decades. So I was sort of wandering from person to person, gazing at them and thinking, do I feel a special connection with you?
Right.
What do we have in common?
Right.
Because of, what does it mean to share DNA, and how significant is it? And I was very fascinated by the experience, and I gave some of that fascination to one of the three siblings who are at the heart of the novel. So the boy I seem to have gone a long way from the boy.
No, this is perfect. I'm taking notes because I have questions about every single thing you've said. So it's perfect.
The boy in the field begins one September day when three teenagers, are walking home from school, and they find a boy in a field who's been wounded. And in the aftermath of that event, the boy recovers. His injuries aren't fatal, but in the aftermath, each of the three teenagers goes on a separate quest. The oldest, Matthew, becomes a quasi-detective figure, looking for the boy's assailant. The middle sibling, Zoe, she's 15, nearly 16, goes looking for someone who will see her, who will see her as Zoe, not as a sibling, not as a daughter or a sister. And the youngest of the siblings, Duncan, who's 13 and is adopted, suddenly thinks that maybe he does want to find his birth mother, if that's at all possible. An idea that has never occurred to him before.
Yeah, it's such an incredible premise for a book, and it does, as one of the, you've gotten already such tremendous reviews of this book, deservedly so. And the one, I think it was in the New York Times, that said, it sort of presents itself as a whodunit, and that, by beginning a book this way with this fascinating, odd mystery, and so, obviously presents itself as, as you're reading it, you really want to know what happened to this boy. And that remains completely interesting and pulls you through the book. But very quickly, what becomes much more interesting is how the lives of these three young people is altered by this, but in a way that is kind of only obliquely related to the boy. It's not like a direct, this happened because of that. And I was wondering, like, when you talked about your friend, did he, the one who found the woman at the bottom of the stairs, did he sort of know at the time that these changes in his life were because he found this? Like, did he make that link in the moment, or did he only make that link after?
My impression from our single meeting,
okay, right,
is that he only made the link long afterwards.
Interesting.
And that at the time he was really unaware that he didn't tick the box to study medicine. He instead became an accountant, and as if to distance himself from Scotland even further, moved to America.
Wow. It's like an inciting incident in his life that he didn't even realize was an inciting incident until later, which I think we all probably have those that we don't. Could we have one? We could have one today that we don't realize is the thing that's going to alter us. And that's one of the things I found so fascinating and so compelling about this book. Was, among many things, was just how little we understand why we're doing the things we're doing, and the reasons that we sort of invent for why we're doing them are often different from what actually the real cause is. And like a more like just curious question, like, did you start, was it always, so you have this origin story for you of the woman at the bottom of the stairs and this guy, did you always start with the boy in the field, or did you start with, like, as if it were me, because I have no imagination, I would have started a book with the woman in the bottom of the stairs and made your friend the character and just kind of gone from there. Like, why a boy in a field, and why three young people who interact with him? Where did that all come from, if you know?
You have a fabulous imagination, Chris. So I'm going to completely rebuff that. I really was interested in subverting the genre of the detective story, and I was aware that many detective stories begin with the body of a young woman, and I really wanted to go against that in several respects. And I think that I really wanted to write about young people and about that confusing intersection between where we think we're making a choice, we think we're making a decision. We use the verb make as a very active verb. And yet so much of what happens in our lives is random or coincidental. And I think that painful discovery, as you begin to discover the role of luck, the role of the random in your life, is a very, very interesting moment. I'm also really interested in how every member of a family experiences being in a family differently. That if you take any group of siblings, I would suggest you will get very different life stories. And there's something fascinating about the way families are like tribes, but people want to belong to the tribe, but at the same time, every member of the tribe is striving in a certain way to get away from the tribe.
Right. Well, this is such, like, it's interesting you say that, because this is such a nice family. I mean, in the sense that this is the kind of family that, and by nice, I mean, these are good people. I mean, they're flawed. They're they have their own, whatever, insecurities and all kinds of things. But this is not a story about a highly dysfunctional family where terrible things happen, right? There are these three siblings and two parents who whose point of view I don't think we ever we ever get. We're only in the three children's heads, and the parents are, especially the mother, kind of nurturing. They're open. They let the kids drink wine. They sit around and they have these. It feels all very civilized, and it's the kind of family that when I'm reading, I think, well, if I were any of these kids, I would be like fully I would like my parents would be my friends and confidants, and yet all the kids have these secrets, right? From the parents, from themselves, and the parents have these secrets from each other that the kids some of them know, some of them half know. They sort of talk about it. So I guess what I'm saying is you have probably one of the most functional families I've seen in literature, and yet it's still a family in which people don't really know each other, and in which they continually move past each other. And yet it doesn't feel like a bleak vision at all. That doesn't feel like necessarily a indictment of anything. It actually feels most like a realistic portrayal of, how people are, So I don't know if there's a question there, but it's essentially just agreeing with what you said. I don't know if you have a response to that at all, but.
Well, it was a very deliberate artistic choice, both to set the novel in 1999 when people were worrying about Y2K. Everybody was sort of looking for danger, but really looking in the wrong direction.
Right.
As we realized on 9/11, for instance, and on many other occasions. And also I decided my three siblings were not going to particularly use bad language or they would all have secrets, but they wouldn't be terrible secrets necessarily, or outrageous secrets, I think, from the point of view of the reader.
Right.
And I think that's one of the mother of a dear friend once said to me, apropos not of literature but of life, everyone has a secret sorrow. And I think of Matthew, Zoe, and Duncan, each having something that's a secret that they hold close.
Yes, and I think any reader any human, when they hear someone say that, everybody has a secret sorrow. I can't imagine that doesn't resonate with every human being in the world, And this is what great literature does, right? We see ourselves reflected in these three teenagers in Oxford in 1999, people probably with whom we have almost nothing in common, and yet we have nothing in literal common, but as humans we share the fact that we all have that secret sorrow, and with the way we see that play out for each of them is so compelling. And I really sense, I don't know if it was I think it was with all the characters, including, and I won't give it away, but including some of the characters who we can't talk about, a real kind of loneliness, in each of them, and in the parents, and I think that comes from this inability of anyone to ever really fully connect, with someone else. And I think you've said that I think I read an interview with you, or maybe we've talked about this over wine at one time, but that one of the things that interests you so much in writing and in literature is the fact that people can't ever fully know each other, right? That people can never fully enter into, as much as we talk about empathy, as much as we talk about connection, that there is always, even among the most intimate people, an inability to fully understand each other. And so, I sense that going through this work. It sounds like that's part of what you were getting at.
Yes, and I would say that one of the things E.M. Forster claims in aspects of the novel is one of the deep pleasures of literature is that we can know a character better than we can know our family members and friends. And he thinks that's part of what novels offer us. So in a sense, The Boy in the Field, we know the characters better than they know each other.
Right.
And that's the privilege of the reader.
Absolutely.
Just like after reading Leading Men, I felt I knew Frank and Tennessee and Anna better than they knew
Knew
themselves.
themselves. Exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, that's definitely, I mean, that's the sort, yeah, that is the great privilege of reading that kind of dramatic irony, right? Of knowing what the characters don't know. And there's so much, again, that is a theme I've seen go through, you know, a number of your books, but I do feel like it's particularly compelling and particularly, you know, drawn so beautifully in this book. And to go back a little bit to something else you said about coincidence, this line on page 180 really stood out for me, where one of the, I forget exactly, I meant to write down the context. I remember, but I can't say what it was. But that somebody says that that this was the season of miraculous encounters, people guided by stars, angels, coincidences. And there are, I mean, again, it seems like a very intentional number of significant chance encounters in this book. And I was wondering as I read it, like whether you were trying to say something about that, about life in general and the role of coincidence and chance and randomness, or about life particularly in a smallish town like Oxford, or both, you know. And I wondered if there was a particular role that coincidence and randomness had in your own life that you were drawing from. Maybe it's this situation with finding your long lost family in Australia. I don't know, but sounds like that was part of it. But I would love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Well, like my school friend, finding the body of a woman, my life too jumped the tracks as a teenager. I had come down from Scotland to London for the weekend, and I was on the tube in London, making my way to the bus station to catch the overnight bus back to Scotland. And I met a man. And that meeting completely changed my life. It's the reason I'm sitting here today talking to you. If I'd caught a different tube train, you know, so having one's own life founded on something so random or so coincidental, there's something a little unnerving or strange about it. And
absolutely.
But then when I talk to other people, I think many people are probably in that situation. It's you know, it's relatively rare to have a life that goes from A to B to C to D, rather than goes from A to G and then jumps around the alphabet.
Yes. No, I know. It really brings up those questions of like, yeah, when something like that happens and you think, of course, if I hadn't gone on that train, if I hadn't gone to that party, if I hadn't done this, you know, what would my life be like? And also how you kind of question, like I don't mean to ask you about this man, but you know, like question, well, why did this happen with this person? And am I like, I don't know, how much can I trust this thing that's happened? It seems so arbitrary. Why am I investing so much in this when it could have been anybody, you know? And I think that we all, again, something that we all go through and all think about, that we can only see, we can't understand it fully in our own experiences, but we have some control over it when we're reading about it in a book, you know, and we actually can see it more clearly when it's not us, right? So anyway, that's, again, not a question, but a following up on that. I love that whole theme, if you want to call it that goes through this book. And so changing directions a little bit, I was curious about, so I know for Mercury and for some of your other, for Mercury in particular, you spent time with horses and you went to gun shops and you did that kind of research. And I was curious if there was anything similar in this book that you found yourself learning or doing more kind of a deep dive into I imagine you got some insight from your husband into some of the painting, and art descriptions. But I wondered, for example, if you were like suddenly discovered you love Spinoza, or whether Spinoza was a new person to you. Anyway, just what do you have any kind of little discoveries or deep dives in this book that you didn't in other books?
I think there's always a discovery in writing a book. I'm sure that must be true for you. That and if I weren't writing a novel, I think I would pretend to be writing one so that I could do research and
right. Oh, it's the best part, right? Absolutely.
So, entering into my characters, just trying to think in the case of Matthew, the oldest, about what would it be like to really, there are lots of children's books in which children try to be detectives, The Famous Five and The Secret Seven, and but what would it really be like to try to find an assailant, and what could you do as a private person with not many resources when the internet was not really available in 1999? And in the case of Zoe, I spent quite a lot of time in Oxford, walking the streets and remembering myself as a teenage girl, walking the streets and watching the teenage girls, I hope nicely, to see what interested them. In the case of Duncan, I spent quite a lot of time investigating rules around adoption, which have changed a lot in Britain, and rules around privacy and how you could hope to find, again, how could you hope to find someone? What are the chances? And I did do research into philosophy. I talked to various friends and said, tell me about causation, tell me about Spinoza, tell me things I don't know.
Love that. Yeah, because again, I feel like that there's this overarching mystery, and then there are these characters who are trying to figure out the answer to, some more than others, the answer to what happened to this boy, and then also trying to figure out their own histories and doing their own kinds of research, and so that there's this endless curiosity in this book. That seems to come directly from your own endless curiosity. And I felt that way as I was reading the book. Like, this could only be written by someone who is endlessly curious about the way that people, act, and the way that, again, as we've been saying, the way people understand themselves and each other. Duncan, I loved all the characters, but I particularly connected with Duncan. He seems to me to have, of the three, the most kind of palpable kind of longing, and that kind of loneliness that I referenced earlier. And he does have this incredible sound. It seems like an incredible talent in painting, and the way that he sees colors, and the way that he I love the way one of the sort of, I know you're a writing teacher, and I know one of the things that we teach students is that if you're in a character's point of view, that you need to see the world the way that unique character sees it, not the way that you might see it, and not even necessarily the way it actually is, but the way that character would see it. And I loved, and this was true, of course, for all three of the main characters, that they saw Zoe saw the world the way that Zoe would see it, and Matthew as well. But Duncan in particular, being a painter and being an artist, really saw the world almost like I could see the color. I could just see the way he saw everything in colors and in this uniquely colorful way. And I was just wondering if, is that what your relationship to art is, and what those if you did have conversations with Eric about these things, or other artists, or whether you love Morandi. I don't know. I'm just curious about just Duncan and the way that you created him as an artist.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I do love that my book is so vivid and colorful. I really appreciate that.
That was a nice touch.
And yeah, this at the same time, around the same time as I met the man on the tube, I also briefly had a job at the Edinburgh Festival, the Edinburgh Arts Festival, working at an exhibition of artists from Dusseldorf. And it was really the first time I'd collided with modern art, with contemporary, or not modern art, contemporary art. And it was just mind-blowing. And much later, I saw a beautiful exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum in New York of the work of the Italian painter Giorgio Morandi, died in, I want to say, 1964. And it was a really hypnotizing, exquisite exhibition. Everyone who was there was sort of lingering and taken up in it. And later, I bought the catalogue and kept looking at it, and later read a description by the Italian writer Umberto Eco about how as a schoolboy in 1948, his city had had a little exhibition of contemporary art, and it was the first time he'd seen work by contemporary painters, and one of those painters was Morandi, and there was a single Morandi painting, and he went back every day to look at that painting for the 2 weeks that the exhibition was on. And I think I'm forgetting what your question is, but looking at art is is a very large part of my life. And living with someone who paints, I spend a lot of time thinking about this thing for which we don't really have language, which is really what we spend an awful lot of time doing as writers. Don't really have a language for so many of the things we want to write about.
Right.
You know, for love or the soul or all those things.
And the way that, if I remember correctly from the book, the way that Morandi painted the same, was it the same bottles over and over, or was it like, it was, again, I'm not going to do it justice because it was described so beautifully in the book. And that felt like a metaphor to me for writing, the way that was described. I don't know if you remember if you wanted to speak of that a little bit.
No, Morandi had a group of bottles or vases that he painted over and over. They weren't always the same. And in his studio, he had a set of shelves, and bottles and vases begin on the lowest shelf, and they gradually make their way up the shelves, and then they enter the painting. So he did rotate them, but he also did come back to the same ones over and over. Until you realize that in a way they're irrelevant. Right.
Well, it also speaks a little bit to the obsessiveness, right, of any kind of true artist, right? That just kind of that whatever you want to call it, a fixed idea, an obsession, or whatever it is, something that you try over and over again to get at. Maybe again it's that question we discussed earlier, of how we can't know each other, or how we are, endlessly disconnected, or whatever it is. But that we just, no matter how many books we write, no matter how many books we read, or how many conversations we have like this, like we still can't quite grasp it, and we kind of don't want to, maybe, like, because otherwise we would have no reason to go on, so and so it's just such a pleasure to read about this, another art form, Duncan in this case, and his own art, and looking at that in the book through the lens of the art of writing. I just wanted to say that I really particularly enjoyed that element of it. Let me see. I have another question here that I. Of course, I had a point of view question, but just to get back in the nerdy sort of writer parts of it, in terms of the sort of, for lack of a better word, like narrative strategy that you had for the way to tell this story. Did you always have this idea that it would be three different points of view, three kids who are teenagers who share a certain kind of sensibility, but who are very different in the way they see the world. was that always was that part of the project for this, or did that evolve as you wrote it?
I really, really wanted to write a grown-up book. And
Mm-hmm.
by that, I mean, I really, really wanted to write in the omniscient point of view.
Okay.
So I set forth in my opening chapter
Mm-hmm.
to do that. And
Mm-hmm.
I thought, oh, this is working quite well.
Mm-hmm.
When the three teenagers are all in the presence of the boy in the field. But then when I started to write subsequent chapters, it felt clumsy to be going back and forth between them so rapidly. And it also felt like it lowered the suspense. Each of them was having such a different experience that I felt like I needed to give myself over to that experience rather than to try to go quickly from one to the other to the next.
Right. Yeah, and of course the separateness, obviously keeping them separate highlights how they're having these very different experiences, which was part of the book, right? Part of the project of the book. Yeah, whereas an omniscience would have kind of assumed, would have kind of almost connected them too much, right? It would have kind of given them too much shared knowledge or something. I mean, not quite, but maybe you know what I mean. But the book would obviously be very different if it had been told of omniscience.
Yeah, and maybe a better writer, a more skillful writer could have pulled it off, but I didn't feel I had the expertise to.
No, I disagree. Well, first of all, I certainly disagree with that. And what I think happened was, you went into it with an idea and you saw that the material itself didn't accommodate this idea, which another writer would have forced it to accommodate because you want to stick with that darling that you started with, but you were truer to the material than you were to this whatever preconceived notion that you had about it from the beginning. So that's the way I would diagnose it. And it's still pretty grown up, it's the book itself. I was thinking of Middlemarch when you said that, right? Which Virginia Woolf said was a novel for grown-ups, so.
Yeah, so. Well, let's make writing Middlemarch our New Year's ambition, or our Labor Day ambition.
Right, there you go, exactly. Did you have any other, speaking of other books, did you have any other books in mind when you were, I know that, for The Flight of Gemma Hardy, it was inspired, it had a book, it was Jane Eyre that inspired it so much. Were there other kind of models for this book other than maybe detective novels that you had mentioned, because you mentioned earlier detective novels that you had in mind for this?
I thought quite a lot about Elizabeth Bowen's The House in Paris.
House in Paris, right, yeah.
She has these fabulously fierce children. They're much younger than my children, but they're just such fully realized and such vehement characters. So she was a wonderful model. And I thought about Lewis Grassic Gibbon's The Sunset Quair, not a book that's well known in America, but the main character is a teenager when we first meet her, and again she's a very fully realized, passionate character, and that was very helpful in my thinking.
Do you? I mean, it seems like, let me think. You had in The Flight of Gemma Hardy, you have a child as a main character. Time goes by, but there's a child part of the story, and in Mercury, I don't believe there was, right?
They're children, but they're minor characters.
Exactly, and then now you're back to. Do you? I mean, I avoid writing children at all costs, or even teenagers. But you seem somewhat drawn to it. What do you think? Is there anything to say about that, or?
About you're not doing it?
Yeah, please psychoanalyze me. Turn the tables.
I think that there's something about younger characters that offer possibilities for trying out a kind of extremity without eccentricity.
Oh, I love that.
You can rehearse, as it were, certain ideas. Younger characters, I think, tend to be more truthful, more honest. It's interesting. They tend to be, they tend not to take the world for granted, and that's really interesting. The things that we kind of get worn down into taking for granted, they're still questioning and saying, "Wait a minute, why does it have to be this way?"
Right.
I disagree, and all of that really interests me. And I grew up going to Sunday school every week, and my Sunday school teacher had, very much said, the truth will set you free, and a lie is a terrible, terrible sin, and will always be discovered. And I still remain faintly shocked as an adult that that's not the case.
Certainly not now. Yeah.
Even worse.
Exactly.
If he were here, he would march into the White House.
Right.
And tables.
Exactly. That's fascinating. And yeah, I mean, and we have, Margaret makes a point in the chat that, the whole idea of how you know yourself when you are young. And it's this, I feel like young people, again, I don't know young people or write about young people, but what I vaguely remember was vacillating when I was younger, from being absolutely sure I knew everything about myself to being utterly baffled as to, like, thinking, oh, well, the whole point of growing up is that I'm going to find myself, and whoever I am now is not even relevant because I'm moving toward this other person, So being in that flux of an identity state, it is really fascinating kind of grounds for a character. So, and these are such, I mean, these narrators are so, I mean, you write with your characteristic kind of, assurance, and you just know, as a reader, the whole time that you're fully in control of these characters, even though they are themselves may not know exactly why they're doing what they're doing. The reader always feels that you're fully in control of their psychology, and that you believe that they are not just living, breathing characters, but that they have souls, and they certainly have hearts, but it's really their souls that are kind of so evident on the page. And just as a reader, I just find that there's no craft lesson for how to do that. You just have to be you just have to be Margot Livesey to be able to do that. So thank you for that. I think that, I have one last question. I think we have to run up, but, yes. And I hope that this has been on full display the whole time. Yeah.
One of my instructions was to hold up my book.
I was wondering, and you can tell me if this is any sort of spoiler, but I was curious about Lily, who's a dog who appears in the book. And there's a note in the acknowledgments about something about, and I'm not going to mess that up either, but something about if dogs could talk, and I'm curious about, like, if that, like, if you want to talk anything, say anything about that. Because I loved how that resolved, but go ahead.
I'd love to say something about Lily. Well, once again, my Sunday school teacher, Mr. Chisholm, is partly responsible because he told a story about how on Christmas Eve, animals could talk to us in English. Oh, wow. It was a rather chauvinistic story. I mean, it presumed all animals were English speaking. But I spent several Christmas Eves working on the family dog, trying to persuade her to say something. And she remained oddly mute.
Oh my gosh.
And I had forgotten about that for many years when I went to visit a school in New York, and I was meeting with various classes. And the youngest class I met with were 10 years old. And they'd read a couple of my short stories. And I said, do you have any questions for me? Do you have things you'd like to ask me? And one girl raised her hand, and she had a leather jacket and a little briefcase with a combination lock. I mean, you know, she was like an adult in many ways. But the question she asked was, why don't the animals in your stories talk? And I thought that was such a great question, because in most children's books, animals are chatting away. They're chatting a mile a minute. You don't have an animal in a children's book who's not going to talk. What's the point?
Absolutely. Yeah.
then
You return that book. Yeah, go ahead.
And
Sorry.
then the animals shut up.
Right.
And I thought, but do they
I love
have
that.
to?
Right.
So I felt like Duncan needed a companion, needed a soulmate,
Yes.
to help him through these difficult times. And
Yes.
I decided to introduce him to Lily, who maybe talks.
Yes.
Some people.
I won't say anything. Right.
It's your choice.
Yes. She definitely gets, you know, Best Supporting Actress nomination for this novel, because her presence in it, and again, I kind of like so much of this book, I described it to somebody as like each chapter, which is again in a different character's point of view, different siblings' point of view, that each character is like a painting that is being painted as we're reading it, and as the book goes on, the painting gets more and more developed, you know, and by the end, of course, you see them for their the fullness of their characters, and yet there's so much about them also that is utterly unknowable, just like just like the Mona Lisa or whatever. You see this perfect painting, but there's this unknowability about her, and that is true for each of the characters. And Lily is this kind of, like, I feel like Lily is the omniscient narrator in some ways of the book, you know, and we're seeing the book from her perspective, even though that is not a spoiler. That doesn't actually happen, literally. Don't worry, you know. But anyway, I loved that. And there is other magic in this book that, you know, we don't have time to get into now, but Zoe has something of a magical or mystical element to her that is, again, another theme, I think, that runs through a number of your books, how magic and mystery are and mystical things are kind of sitting alongside us, you know, at all times in our lives. You know, I don't know if you had any quick thing to say about that.
I just love what you're saying about magic and mystery. That is so eloquent. Well, I think I am very I mean, on the one hand, I'm the opposite of a new age person. I'm, you know, on the molecules and the, you know, the atomic bonds, not bombs. And, you know, I passionately believe in science, but I'm also really interested in those slightly porous boundaries, if you will, between one life and the next, one idea and the next. And I think many people have some area in which they share that feeling. So they might ridicule a dog talking, but have some idea about the redemptive effects of sunflowers.
Right.
To name one of your favorite flowers.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, or they fully, like, they'll say, there's no way dogs can talk, but they say, oh yeah, like my grandmother visits me in my dreams, and I fully believe it's her, and I fully believe that she's communicating with me. And it's like, pick your magic, you know, like pick your thing that, but I did think you're right that everybody has they may not even think of it as magical or mystical or thinking about porous boundaries and all of those things, but we all have these sort of talismans or superstitions, if you want to call them that, that we sort of need to get out of the workaday relentless realism of our world, of our daily lives, right? Anyway, okay, so was there anything that I didn't ask you about that you wanted readers to know, other than that they should get this book immediately from either Porter Square Books or from East End Books or from bookshop.org or any independent bookstore?
Well, I just think of, I think of what Flannery O'Connor says about reading, about a story, that reading a story is having an experience. And you know, that's what I always feel in the presence of your work, and it's what I hope people will feel in the presence of the boy in the field, that the reader has undergone an experience. And I, in writing the book, one of the mantras I came back to was what Walter Mosley, author of Devil in a Blue Dress and many other mystery stories, once said. He said, you know, every story should be a mystery story.
I love it.
I think that's such a great thing to hold on to. So I hope there's true mystery in these pages, and as well as quite a lot of plot, because one of my ambitions was to write a short novel in which quite a lot happened.
Yes, well, you've definitely succeeded in that. It really, I described it to someone as sly as well, because it does, again, it has this literal mystery, but it's almost in a way a red herring. Even though it's interesting on its own, the internal mysteries were to me more compelling. Not that they're in competition, but you know what I'm saying. that there are multiple mysteries, and it's not necessarily the one that you think. So anyway, thank you so much for this conversation and for this amazing book, and I wish you so much success and luck with it. Literally no one deserves it more than you. So I wish you so much luck with it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for entering so fully into my novel, for asking the best questions of my characters, for making me feel seen as a writer. I'm so appreciative of your beautiful work